Now, do stay with us because I'm handing over to Dovile here next to me to just chair the panel discussion with all of our speakers.
Thank you, Lisa. So it's a great honor and pleasure to moderate the panel on the regulatory aspects today. First of all, I would like to thank all the speakers for investing their time with us today and for your very interesting presentations earlier. I'm very pleased to see that this panel gathers so many high-level and experienced speakers contributing to the topic from different perspectives. I would like to kick off the panel from starting asking some questions and mixing my own questions with the questions from the audience. So I will start from Stephen. Stephen, first of all, I also have to apologize for keeping you awake so late. I think it's about 2 o'clock in the morning now in Australia. But we also have some, habit which is getting there. Sometimes I get invited in the conferences in Australia and have to wake up at 4 a.m. So it's, fair enough. Stephen, we had a question from the audience which I really liked. So I'm wondering if I start from the easier or from more complicated. So maybe from the easier. Could you please comment on a prospect of an Artemis Accords as a ground for the regime shift from the UNOSA to some regional platform?
Hi, thanks to Villa, and yes, it's 10 to 2 in the morning now, so if I start slurring my words, please forgive me, everyone. It's an interesting question. All I can really say is repeat what I've said before in terms of Artemis Accords is obviously a really significant development in this whole discussion, and clearly a lot of work has gone into it, and clearly a lot of interaction between lots of governments and officials has gone into it, and so the principles there are very well thought through. The question seems to indicate that perhaps Artemis is a signpost for regional governance of, let's say, resource activity. I'm not sure, I'm a great fan, as I think many of us are, of the multilateral process, because in the end, and I think every speaker has acknowledged this, lots of countries have ambitions to engage in these activities, and some of those countries are not in the Artemis program, or some of those countries are perhaps doing things in other arrangements. And so the ideal end product of whatever structures we have must, in my opinion, and I say this in my personal capacity, of course, involve all the stakeholders, and certainly be one that everybody who has an intense interest in lunar activities, in celestial body activities, and in mining activities, that all of those people have buy-in to the process. As I said in my presentation, Artemis raises some really, really interesting, innovative ideas, as well as reinforcing things from the treaty frameworks that we have. And so Artemis clearly is a really, really important input. And it has the support of an increasing number of countries, as Gabriel was saying. But we have a broad community of countries that are interested in these activities. And so I hesitate to think that we'll have regional divergency in terms of the way people interact at these activities on celestial bodies. I think the answer must be a multilateral arrangement where there's buy-in from all stakeholders, and in particular all of those that have the capability to undertake these activities in the short term, although of course it's relevant for all countries. I hope that answers the question, and thanks for starting off with the easy one.
The next one is more intriguing. So Australia ratified the Moon Agreement and then signed the Artemis Accords. are both documents compatible?
No, that's a question that I'm asked all the time. Clearly, the Australian government and the Space Agency who signed the Adams Accords looked at this question very carefully. And so I was not personally involved in the discussions because of the other roles I've got. But clearly, they have taken a view that there's nothing incompatible with being signatory to Artemis that would constitute a violation of Australia's obligations under the Moon Agreement. I do know that the Australian government is preparing a public statement. I assume that will be at Legal Subcommittee, although I can't be sure, where the Australian government the Australian delegation will give its interpretation of the obligations and rights under the Moon Agreement and how that is in accordance with what it's taken on as a signatory of Artemis. There has been a lot of scholarship already on this point, and many people have said that they are incompatible. I think I'll leave that, given I'm in a delegate position here, I'll leave that to others to postulate. But clearly, the Australian government, as a good international citizen, has taken a particular view, and it remains to be seen whether that view is one that most people subscribe to or not. So perhaps, Davila, I haven't answered your question because I don't think I'm in a position where I can, but hopefully others might have a stronger view on this and feel that they can speak out a bit more. So sorry to duck that one, Davila, but I suspect you understand. Thanks.
I think your answer is perfect. Thank you very much. I will turn to Mr. Andrzej Smysztal. So, Mr. Smysztal, you are a diplomat who is active at the international forum since many years. You also served as a chair at the legal subcommittee of UN COPUOS. We observe that the industry is developing, that there is a growing interest in the activities of space resources, and this conference is also a proof of that. However, still some and quite many legal questions are not yet solved and addressed. So I'm wondering, from your perspective, what shall we realistically expect from the international discussions? What are the biggest challenges for us, the governments?
Well, I think that the challenges we observe and we talk about are the chances that we have, again, because we lived through the challenges in the 60s when they were like the beginning only of the exploration of outer space, far from cooperation, but then it was a cooperation. I think the major breaking point was that the two major powers in outer space decided to create a common multilateral body which was and is COPUOS, and to agree on some principles that were enshrined in the outer space treaties. That was important, and we might say that that was absolutely not possible to achieve this goal at that time, but it was. And all the codification at that time that was done by the COPUOS reflects the state of play of the technology and of the plans for exploration of outer space at that time, at that particular time. Now we are far away from that situation. We are more advanced. I mean, we, several states, of course, and those who want to cooperate and participate in the exploration. And yeah, we can say that the international law on outer space is far from let's say, satisfying the expectations of the business, especially in terms of the exploration of outer space. Well, we can always try to improve that, and we are there for this because the legal subcommittee has this unique mandate to fill the legal gaps in the Outer Space Treaty. And what I always say, even International Commission, the Law Commission of the United Nations left the outer space totally for the jurisdiction, let's say, of the COPUOS. So I think there is still possibility. And And they developed a lot of guidelines, a lot of documents which are not seen by several states as legally binding, but they provide us with certain, let's say, principles on how to interpret Outer Space Treaty and how to see our responsibilities and rights in relation with the exploration of outer space. So, again, we are there, the states, the people who are deciding. This is not the business of a kind of organization which is supranational organization called United Nations. United Nations, this is us. We can decide, we can negotiate, we can try to find our ways. We can tell people everybody's invited. There's no precondition of your participation in this exercise. Let's try to do it again and try to formulate some legal framework in order to move forward. And we will see. Well, nobody is perfect, and we will not create an international body of law which will be perfect for all at all times. You know, there will be always some another additional gaps, and law will be always behind what is really needed, but there is no other way than to create a multilateral base for that.
Thank you, Andrzej, for this wonderful answer. So, Carlos, I will turn to you. Earlier today, you made an interesting point about the private company needs and interests. And in your opinion, what is the biggest challenge for granting public access to the data generated by the private companies? How far the private company would be prepared to go in sharing the collected data?
Thank you, Davile, for the question. A really good question. And I would like to answer the question by asking some questions back. Right? But mainly the challenges that we have, of course, is commercial confidentiality and commercial advantage, right? Yes. And because we're a commercial company that sells data, of course, the life and health of our company will be dependent on revenues generated by data. So then this raises questions for us. Like first is, will it be legislation? Will it be a legal requirement, right? And then if it is, that of course I think is going that way, is which data needs to be shared, to who, how much, and when, right? So for instance, a first question is, do we need to release resources exploration information for safety, let's say for interference purposes? Maybe not. Maybe yes, in terms of coordinates. To industry, as one of our presenters just before, in terms of not duplicating work, then maybe it's advisable to share some data to not duplicate work. And of course, to the scientific community. And if the answer is yes, then the next question is how much of the data do we need to share? Of course, to not compromise again our commercial advantage and competitive advantage. And then the other question is, if we do have to share this data, is when do we need to share it? Mm-hmm. For instance, if it is for safety reasons, do we need to share the data every week, every day, every month, every second, in terms of orbiters? Or if it is for the scientific community, like if it becomes requirement, do we need to share maybe some data every year, right? And for the industry, this is a point that I wanted to make. For instance, just to put as an example, in Western Australia, companies that have a lease, let's say a safety zone, and they are required to open and share the exploration data every 5 years. This is within the lease. But if the lease is broken, they have to release the data like after 3 months. So the question for us, let's say in the mining industry, we know that from exploration to an operation, if it goes well, it's around 10 years. But in space, as we know, the times might be bigger. So therefore, if becomes legislation to, let's say, share exploration data, will it be 5 years? Or maybe will it be 10, 20 years? So that's, I guess, the question. If we have a safety zone, but if our safety zone is depleted, then when do we need to open the data? After a year, after 5 years? And I think there's a number of questions that, as for us, private industry, commercial companies, need to be answered.
Thank you, Carlos. I think that the answer to your questions would be that we have to find the right balance between the interests of the state, public interest, and also the commercial private company interest. And with this, I will turn to Gabriel, because You made a very interesting presentation earlier today. Artemis program will also involve private companies, and in case you rely on private sector partners, how do you plan to find that balance that Carlos is also looking for between the public interest on the one hand and the commercial interest on the other hand? Where is the golden middle here?
Thank you. No, it's a great question, and it's come up through multiple speakers. So I think it's obviously of critical importance to the private sector here. The way we've tried to do this is to create a starting point for the Artemis Accords, right? The Artemis Accords certainly doesn't answer all the questions, and I think many of the speakers from Stephen and others have outlined a number of questions that we're going to need to continue working on at multilateral fora as well as nationally. With regards to that balance between private sector and government activities, and in particular with regards to data, the balance we've tried to strike, at least in the Artemis Accords, is to focus on government activities. The Artemis Accords itself, although we hope it will form a guideline for purely commercial activities, it's really directed at national civil space programs. And what we mean by that are what you think of as traditional exploration programs, like those undertaken by NASA or the European Space Agency. So the idea here is that if a government or a country is engaged in civil space exploration themselves, if they use commercial actors to do that, which we intend to do on the United States side and we expect others to do as well, we still expect those commercial actors to follow the provisions that we would normally expect for a government. And so that means open data, scientific information, all of that. We expect that to be built in. For example, if NASA has a contract with, I don't know, SpaceX, you saw the recent announcement about the human landing system and SpaceX was selected. If NASA enters into a contract with SpaceX to do something with regards to lunar resources, for example, we would expect NASA to include contractual provisions with SpaceX to make that information publicly available, just as if NASA had done it with a NASA-owned vehicle. So that's for civil space activities. Now, what's different then, of course, is if there's a purely commercial activity. If SpaceX or someone else were to go up, iSpace, we'll say, were to go up and do something on their own behalf, not on behalf of a government, but to do a purely commercial activity, that would not fall within the provisions of the Artemis Accords. And of course, we recognize that there may well be proprietary data and commercially sensitive information in those situations, and they are probably going to need some somewhat different provisions to recognize that commercial reality. So I think the starting point, it's not the end of the question, your question about balance, but the starting point, I think, is to make a distinction between civil space activities, which are on behalf of governments and designed to benefit all of humankind, and more purely commercial activities, which probably do need at least some somewhat different provisions, at least with regards to things like proprietary information. I think many of the other provisions of the Accords, such as deconfliction of activities and emergency assistance, those translate very clearly into the commercial sector. But with regards to data and information sharing, there probably do need to be some somewhat different provisions.
Thank you, Gabriel. And I have another question for you from the public. Have other countries or organizations been involved in the formulation of the Accords, or is it a bit my way or miss out? And the person who was asking the question, he also said that I think that was the critique from Russia.
That's a good question. So I certainly don't want to speak about closed diplomatic conversations, right? Whenever countries speak through diplomatic channels, it's important to maintain the confidentiality of that. So I don't want to speak on behalf of other countries, but I can say that yes, absolutely. Other countries than those who just signed the Accords have and are and will be involved in these conversations. The way we, the United States government at least, started these conversations was really to focus on answering the near-term questions. And as I said, this really derived from the Artemis program itself. We're trying to provide specific guidance to our actual operators at NASA and otherwise. So because of that impetus, we thought it was most important to focus on those countries as an initial matter that we knew we were going to actually be doing things with in outer space, on the moon, and then onwards to Mars. So we focused initially in conversations with those countries who had already reached out to NASA or the United States government and said, we want to be involved in this particular program, and here's some potential ways why. So we said, great. If you want to build a lander or robotic missions or provide, subcomponents to a human landing system, if we do that, here are some common starting points. So that was the real idea, was to focus in the first instance on those countries with whom we actually would be doing these things, because those are the ones that we really need to have critical understanding on questions like deconfliction and space resources and human heritage. But that is not the end of the conversation. Right? If other countries are interested in using these accords or the multilateral system, we think that would be beneficial. The idea is that they're all tied so clearly to the Outer Space Treaty that whether or not you agree with signing the accords themselves, countries that are parties to the Outer Space Treaty still have these same obligations. So to take the deconfliction obligation, right, whether or not you're a party to the Outer Space Treaty, you mentioned Russia, whether or not you're a signatory to the Artemis Accords, Russia is a party to the Outer Space Treaty. So Article 9 still requires them to give due regard to the interests of other countries. It still requires them to consult before causing harmful interference. And in application, if you actually do those things, if you comply with those obligations, we think you're going to end up in a very similar place to the Artemis Accords, whether you actually admit it or not, whether you actually sign the accords or not. Because this is so closely tied to the Outer Space Treaty and the realities of implementation and the realities of operating on the moon and then onwards to Mars, we think you're going to end up in if not identically, in a very similar place, one way or the other. So the Artemis Accords is a clarifying document that's intended to create a common understanding, a starting point to have future conversations at COPUOS and elsewhere. We think it's useful for our partners and for others who want to clearly state their commitment to the principles of the Outer Space Treaty. But it doesn't have to be the only way to do that. If other countries want to take pieces of the Artemis Accords and use those, they certainly can. Same for COPUOS, same for the potential working group out of the Legal Subcommittee on Space Resources. But at least it means that those countries that are participating in the Artemis program will be approaching these from a common perspective. And if we accomplish nothing else, then we see that as a significant achievement.
Thank you, Gabriel. And I have to compliment also that it shall not be forgotten that all the 8 first signatory countries, we had long meetings and we actually negotiated all those accords. It's not something imposed on us. So I will turn to Eric. Eric, so you talked about data sharing in scientific ESA missions. I imagine those missions are fully financed. And also in data sharing within the purely commercial investigations. How would data policy change and would apply in co-financed activities? For example, we could imagine that the company brings about 25% of funds or 50% of funds, but it's not purely commercial activity itself.
Yeah, thanks for the question. We have had already this in practical case. So the way to regulate that is to operate via what I call the process data sets. So if there is intellectual property coming from one of the stakeholders of let's say, broad scientific team, including private companies, the principle is that not only the scientists, but the private companies forming this team along a project will get access to all the information. So we do not foresee to have segregated release of information between partners of the same project. That's one of the elements. However, with respect to release to the public at a later stage, after this exclusivity period I was mentioning, process data sets can actually be regulated such that they do not become public the way the publicity comes for data fully controlled by the agency. So we believe that there is a way to create a good ecosystem, providing confidence to actors who really need to value their intellectual property in performing research, applied research, and there is in practice the way to do it. We will never release this data without their approval. The system that we have in place handles that properly. It's extremely important to have that discussed before you perform your activities. If you wait and you postpone this important discussion, you end up in practice often in a mess. And that's helping no one, starting with your customer. So hybrid teams can operate. This is a reality and will continue to be. So I'm excluding the purely commercial activities, as Gabriel was mentioning, where proprietary data is not our concern, actually. But in all the other cases, we do have a way to fulfill and respect the not only the obligations, but also the wishes of our partners.
Thank you, Eric. I will turn to Jeff. There was a very interesting question from the public addressed to you. Are there any concepts or practices to foster equitable access to the lunar resources? So I believe that those concepts or practices to foster equitable access would be inspired by terrestrial mining regulation.
Okay, I'll try to address the question as best I can. So, well, one of the things that makes it interesting in the terrestrial mining environment is that, you know, once you've been qualified to get involved in sort of staking a claim, it's actually not that expensive. And the ongoing work requirement to keep your claims in good order through a lot of the world is relatively modest. So it's fairly open and democratic in that regard for it. In addition, there's a recognition in a lot of places where certain potential areas are reserved, whether that's for Aboriginal or Indigenous groups to ensure that they get a share of the resources. And in certain cases, members of the community, either through government control of either a portion of the claims or royalties and other things involved with there. Of course, predicated on all of this, of course, is having an agency that can exercise regulatory authority on all of this. And of course, we have an absence of that right now. And that's where, you know, the investment community is very interested in knowing that they, in effect, can't have people claim jumping with what's going on, and that you can have some commercial protections for that and some certainty because it simply makes a lot of sense with it. I don't think that mineral claims should be easily staked in outer space unless those entities who are doing so have the ability to actually move forward with it, or else you can get in a situation on a terrestrial basis like we get with in the internet with you know, certain website URL names being squatted on by individuals who are hoping to extract economic rents from it. And you don't want to see a similar thing because that will hold up and inhibit investment and engagement in outer space activities. So this is something that needs to be addressed, and why it probably shouldn't be open to just about everybody, but you need to be a qualified individual or company or government to be able to engage in those activities. So hopefully that provides some thoughtful perspective.
Thank you, Jeff. Giuseppe, the last question goes to you. With the MVA, you work on different projects which lay the groundwork for the future regulation. How much consideration is being put to environmental concerns?
Well, environmental concern is definitely a very important one. And I think within what we are doing in the GESGLA, it's an important topic. Environment is meant basically to maintain the sustainability. So it has different connotation. It has basically the connotation of leaving the place where you're going not as a mess, as some people might think, but I think the more important part is to make sure that we have sustainable lunar activity. As you know, in Earth orbit, we didn't do a good job. And I think we have to be very honest also vis-a-vis the public. The problem of debris around Earth is known to everyone. We try now to go behind the fact. Now, on the moon, we are trying to basically go ahead. And so I think in a number of areas, we really have to make sure that, for instance, debris, which is part of the environment, are pretty much basically taken into account by means of guidelines. So the short answer is environment is an extremely important because it has an impact on sustainability, and all the activity that we are preparing in some of the activity to the MVA is related basically to the environment. And if I may just add, just a general remark, I think we have been talking about a number of regulatory or a number of different way in a multilateral way to come together. The good news, because of course we always have to look to the good news, and there are many good news, is that right now there is a strong, at least the way I see it, commitment by a number of stakeholders to really get engaged and trying to define all what we said, the framework. Before, in an unofficial way, in order hopefully to go faster in a formal way like the COPUS. There is a lot of understanding and determination. The people understand, especially the major stakeholders, that they need to engage maybe first and informally to taste the water, the temperature of the water, and then later in a more formal way in a formal forum like the COPUS. And this is what is important also for the public and for the people which are following us to understand that everybody is committed to try to find a solution, for instance, to the lunar governance. And I think it's just a matter of time, and I'm pretty optimistic that all the major stakeholders will come and will find a solution together.
There is something wrong with the sound. Okay, perfect. So there are so many interesting questions, and I apologize that we couldn't answer to all of those questions. I'm so happy to hear so many positive ideas, so much of positive also contributions to these discussions. So thanks to everyone, and Lisa, I hand over to you.
Thank you so much, everybody in the room, for your patience. Again, it's been a very, very long and intense afternoon, but I've been following the questions on the chat. Really very, very deep questions. So it's a wonderful opportunity to have these breakout sessions, and I'm quite sure it's the same for all of the parallel sessions going on right now. Hopefully, many of you can join us either in the room or online tomorrow as well. And first session up tomorrow is Terrestrial to Space, which is going to be chaired by Joseph Musil, who is sitting in the room here. It's become his home for the week. And then that will be followed by 2 more parallel sessions, R&D Needs and Gaps, chaired by Aidan Cowley again, and also in parallel to that, Financing and Business Models, and that will be here chaired by Roberto Cossu. So thank you all so much for paying attention. Continue to network if you wish after perhaps a little break through the course of the night and before our session begins tomorrow. Thank you and good night.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.